would you still be you? If I took your head off and I put it on another body, would that still be you? My name is Brandy Schillace, and I wrote Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher.
Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher were one and the same man, a Cleveland-based neuroscientist and neurosurgeon named Robert White, who wanted to do the unthinkable and nearly succeeded.
One of Dr. White's favorite books was Frankenstein, and I think we can kind of understand why. One of his goals was to perform a head transplant. And he worked quite a lot on animal models, and that means he was doing experimentation, trying to isolate the brain, and that means removing it from its shell and seeing how it worked outside of an animal's body. He was so interested in this preservation of life that for him, bringing that brain into, a safe place made so much sense. And if your body was dying, but your brain was still alive and healthy, he really thought that you might be able to live longer if you could transplant another body to your head and brain, and then you might be able to live on. And so while that sounds really fringe and it sounds like science fiction, it's rooted in his belief that saving the life of the brain was of paramount importance. He says to himself, no one has managed to fully isolate a brain that's still alive. And what I mean by that is separate it from its body, have a brain by itself, alive and still thinking. He wanted to do that surgery on primates, rhesus macaques. He starts working on this in the 60s and 70s, and he basically manages to perfect a technique that keeps blood flowing to that animal, partly by slowing that animal down by hypercooling it, but also by using another monkey, a larger monkey, as a body blood donor. So he is essentially creating a monkey feeding blood to another monkey's brain, and ultimately as they peel away those outer layers, the bare bulb of its own, just the brain by itself. It's alive, but it's not inside a skull. And that's fascinating. It's never been done before. It's also pretty gruesome, because it can be really upsetting to read about those issues, particularly, I think, for primates, our nearest evolutionary relative. It's hard to read about someone slowly peeling away the outer covering of a naked brain. Once he had managed this, he had it hooked up to electrodes and he measured brain waves. And it turns out that brain waves were still being produced. That brain outside of a body was still consuming oxygen, was still living, and was still making brain waves. And that began to make him think, you can outlive your body. And that's a peculiar idea, that's science fiction. But he needed to prove it.
Speaking of science fiction,
so they transplanted the white head onto the black body. Who would have suspected that neither would care for the idea too much?
The incredible two-headed transplant.
Who are you? I'm your brother.
The world-famous brain surgeon.
I've had the top of her head off, but that's as far as it went.
Where's the rest of you?
We are joined together temporarily.
So Dr. White really enjoyed science fiction, and that's probably good because he ends up consulting on the second X-Files movie.
But Dr. White's work was anything but imaginary.
He wanted to prove that the brain was alive and thinking. Not everyone was convinced that the blips on the paper really corresponded to thought. Was that really thinking? Was it really alive in there? Was this some kind of reflex? He got his idea for how to prove it after watching the video that was released from Soviet Union at the time of Vladimir Demikov, who had created a surgically connected two-headed dog. That means he had taken the head and forepaws off of one dog and attached it to the larger body of another dog. And both of these dogs were now basically a two-headed dog. They named it Cerberus. And these two-headed dogs, they lived. They could lap up milk. They could Well, one of them could wag their tails, the other one didn't have a tail anymore. And White thought, that's the way you do it. If you keep the face, then you can prove that the eyes still move, that the ears twitch, that the mouth moves, that it's following you with its eyes. He takes a series of monkeys, once again working with 2 monkeys at a time, because in the end you're going to have head A and body B attached together. Slowly, he replumbs the blood supply from one body to the other brain so that that brain is still being fed with oxygen. And slowly they disconnect the head from the body that it was on and remove it. And now they've got these long cords that are connecting this body, its blood supply, to this other monkey's head. They then slowly disconnect that monkey's head and return it to the new body. This was done in 1971. They put everything back together, they stitch around the neck, and they wait for it to wake up. And it does. The monkey wakes up, looks around. It tries to bite Dr. White. It never really liked Dr. White very much. They feed it. Now, granted, this monkey is now paralyzed. You've severed the spinal cord, but it's alive. The head is moving, its mouth is moving, its tongue is moving. It responds to noise, it responds to touch. He proved that this head, this brain, can live outside of its body, still thinking, still having input, still having output, and that this is possible. Once White proved that this was possible, he naturally began to think about ways it might help human beings. And for many of us, that might be a step too far, and we think that's macabre. Now you're getting into that realm of science fiction where you ought not be doing such. Just because science can do something doesn't mean science should. But he was interested in part because this was a man who dealt almost all the time with people in various stages of trauma. He worked for a trauma hospital. And he saw people fade and fail, even though they could have kept going. Their bodies failed them, but their brains had been sharp up to the end.
Dr. White's experiments with primates caught the attention of animal rights groups like PETA. That wasn't the only issue people had with his research.
Opponents brought up something else, which is if you're taking an entire body of organs, that person, if they're an organ donor, could have saved a heart transplant patient and lung transplant and liver and kidney and all of these other things. So if there were 5 people whose lives could have been saved by that body, but you're agreeing to give it to only one person, is that fair? Is it ethical? Is it right? And more importantly, who makes those decisions?
Dr. White continued to try to convince the world that he should perform a human head transplant, but he died in 2010 at the age of 84.
Neurosurgeon, researcher, and personal physician of a pope has died. Dr. Robert White worked at Cleveland's Metro Health Medical Center.
He never got to perform the surgery he dreamed of doing, yet his research to get there is helping people today.
Dr. White's lasting legacy really has a lot more to do with his work as a brain surgeon and as a researcher perfecting therapeutic hypothermia, which is still used today. And in fact, its use has really expanded. In addition to being useful for slowing down the brain's need for oxygen for complicated brain surgeries, it's also being used to protect cardiac arrest victims. If you suffer cardiac arrest and suddenly your heart's not pumping blood where it needs to go, sometimes brain damage would result and the patient would actually perish because of brain damage rather than from the original heart attack. Now they're using perfusion and therapeutic hypothermia as a way of cooling that body down, cooling the brain down, and salvaging brain activity that way. These are really important things, and when he was nominated for the Nobel Prize, it was really for his perfusion work. The other important legacy that doesn't get talked about as much, having an organ in isolation means you can understand how that organ accepts medication. So for the pharmaceutical industry to know what outside of the context of the body is the brain or any other organ going to do with this medicine. And so in that way, the isolation surgeries and creating those models for how a brain operates was really important to future research that built off the back of that.
And the memory of Dr. White remains popular in Ohio.
He was an extraordinary brain surgeon, well regarded throughout the world.
Here in Cleveland, almost everyone seems to know who Dr. White is when you mention him. And if you do mention his name, you're likely to hear someone say, he saved my cousin, he saved my brother, he helped my aunt. All of these people come forward because they remember him mainly as a surgeon who performed thousands and thousands of brain surgeries. The legacies are almost dual in some ways, and this makes sense for someone who is both Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher.